Hello, I'm Gina Cacici, webinar host with CenterWatch. Welcome to today's webinar, Applying the Lessons of the Pandemic to Your Upcoming Trial. This webinar is brought to you by PCM Trials. Since 2008, PCM Trials has led the way in mobile research. Their certified mobile research nurses, CMRNs, are driving the shift to patient-centric, decentralized clinical trials, giving individuals the flexibility to engage in research studies in the ways that work best for them and expanding opportunities for participation.
Thanks,
We're expecting the session to last about 45 minutes, followed by a live question and answer session. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please feel free to prepare questions for our presenter. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the presentation. Questions will be answered at the end. To ask a question, click the Q&A button on the bottom of your window. Type your question and click Submit. Questions will not be viewable to other attendees. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Ellen Weiss is Vice President, In-Home Solutions, Decentralized Clinical Trials at PCM Trials. She is an expert in connecting CROs and sponsors with right-sized hybrid and remote solutions to collect complete data. She has spoken on understanding the logistical support necessary for investigational medicinal product, IMP delivery and sample collection, IMP dosing and sampling considerations, logistic options, and best use cases. Ms. Weiss has deep knowledge of clinical trial research nurses and the services they provide, which enables sponsors, CROs, and site investigators to have confidence that alternate site visits can be carried out with the same data quality and subject safety as on-site visits across all therapeutic areas. She is a member of the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association and a volunteer for the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Ellen, it's great to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Gina. That was very kind, and I am very excited to represent PCM Trials here today. And we see that our topic is applying lessons of the pandemic and how to apply them to your upcoming trial. As we know, human beings learn best by watching others, but sometimes we are called upon by the circumstances of our time to invent on the fly, so to speak. So it's very gratifying for me to share with you some of the perceptions that we have here at PCM Trials of the last 2.5 years and a little bit of time before that era and what we foresee coming up. So for my remarks today, I'm framing my experience of that of an executive at PCM Trials. We have more than 14 years of experience, more than 300 protocols, and we have gotten that special alchemy of getting the right stuff into the right hands at the right place 42,000 times and counting. Of course, that number goes up every day. Visits have occurred since we logged on for this webinar. So we look forward to a bright future with a lot of activity. But I think it's fair that we should take just a moment to define decentralized clinical trial and what we view that as meaning, or in its ever expanding definition, what our activities are in the decentralized space. So we are providing dosing, testing, and a number of assessments and other surveys that take place in the conduct of clinical research. And when we are doing this work, we are really guided, as others are, indeed everyone in the clinical research space, by 3 important factors when it comes to DCT. We have to work within the scope of practice of a registered nurse. There are some geographies in the world where even workaday common activities that we pursue are not viewed as safe for a nurse to administer. And in those locations, we do call on an MD. But for our discussion today, let's confine our thinking space to US-based visits. So we are working with registered nurses, and the scope of that nurse has expanded greatly over the generations, and we look for that trend to continue. But for now, that is one of the three driving factors. The second driving factor, of course, is the portability of the equipment that we are called upon to use in the execution of a home visit. If we take the aggregate weight of the centrifuge, the infusion pumps, all of the kitting, the tubing, the PPE, we know that if we are working in volumes over 40 pounds, that it becomes very difficult for just one person to manage that load. So the portability of the equipment and supplies we carry is the second guide star for us. The third, and perhaps the most important of these, is the acceptable risk profile of this protocol, its IMP, and other factors that go into the design of a trial. I take great pride in saying here at PCM, every single RFP that we entertain does go through a skilled hands triage where we are looking for those factors that may make a home visit either unsafe or undignified for the patient and their family, or too risky from our perspective as the employer of the nurse that will be performing the activity. So through the pandemic time, we all became very aware of the need for mobile research activities. And as I'm sure everyone can agree, COVID is the greatest revelation and accelerator of our time. This was a quote that was on one of those jumbled early pandemic calls with a very large global sponsor as they were trying to grapple with the situation at hand and how could they move their dozens of trials forward. And a lot of that discussion in that March 2020 timeframe, I'm sure we're all very aware, and it's top of our memory, is that home visits had been around since about 2003. So this wasn't a really new idea 17 years later in 2020, but it sure felt like a new idea to many of the folks that I spoke with at the time. So we were able to build on many years of experience in delivering dosing and testing in the home. We were just going to be asked through the experience that COVID provided us to ramp up not only the capacity to serve, but also broaden and deepen the depth of services that we would be asked to take into the home. So I thought that might be important for you all to understand in our audience today, is that there was a long lead path leading up to March of 2020 about what could be imagined to happen in the home, but there was so much resistance. And well, March of 2020 certainly helped to break that resistance down. So let's talk about my remarks today. In my discussion topics today, I'd like to talk about what happened, what we learned as a home visit provider, maybe apply some of those lessons for you all as you are planning and designing and authoring protocols for the future, and maybe a little bit about PCM and what made us fit for purpose for some of the most innovative trials in history, and how our role was to fit within them. So I think we all can remember, I don't need to belabor each and every one of these time points, but I think the first time, and I did make a note of it in my ongoing sort of career notes that I've kept going all the way back to the, good heavens, 1970s. The first note that I have in my look back was on January 8th. I was traveling internationally. I was traveling feeling really confident that everything was fine. And I was actually in an airport lounge looking up at a TV that had CNN on it. And there was a remark by Dr. Fauci, and he used the word virus and interesting in the same sentence. And I immediately pricked my ears up because he has a pretty good track record of alerting early for things that are of interest to him should be maybe of concern to me. So January 8th, I was out of the country and started paying attention. I had a couple of masks in my carry-on bag. I put it on. So starting January 10th is when WHO starts to share that guidance on detection, testing, and beginning to quantify what we now knew to be COVID. Moving a little bit further along in the month, by January 27th, the FDA announces their development of countermeasures. And of course, March 11th, 12th, 13th, I think was when I, as an American, and by then I was stateside, was really solidifying sort of a professional, personal action plan about what should be happening. Well, here at PCM, we began to be very busy, probably from that first panicked call to my boss from overseas to him here stateside saying, you know, this is a thing, and perhaps we better meet about this when I get stateside in a couple of days. And we did. So starting in March 18th, of course, is when many of us faced what we would call lockdown, or really the active phase of countermeasures for COVID. Certainly, our offices went remote. I had worked remote for years, so I didn't detect much of a wobble in my own experience. But to give you an idea of what that experience was looking like from the customer's point of view, I can tell you this. And I'll advance my slide here. So from our chair here at PCM, I can share what the uptake of home visit services anecdotally had been for us. So in a baseline or typical year, say 2017, 2018, 2019, at PCM, I took in 2019, for instance, 72 RFPs, many of which we took on as new studies. In 2020, that number jumped to 881. In 2021, so, you know, steady state into the pandemic, we rounded up at 640. And here on July the 27th, midway through the year, it looks like we're tracking to again exceed 600 proposals for studies. So the interest in uptake was almost immediate, starting about March 13th. I keep a tracker, of course, of all of our opportunities. We work on a Salesforce platform, and you can see that the acceleration of interest was massive. We also knew that our existing studies that we were already serving, their interest in expanding the service jumped dramatically. And we also saw a change in the requested activities that we were being asked to take to field. So in the past, in the prior times, for instance, we might have been asked to take vital signs, but there was very little asked to do physical assessments or examinations. And all of a sudden, that was a must-have. So there were a lot of protocol amendments. I can hear the heavy sighs from all of you out there, remembering that time, as we adjusted SOEs to account for this expansion of services that a nurse could provide. Many of these requests also centered on device implementation and having our nurses act as device coaches for the devices that were moving through the logistics chain from the site and to the patient to keep better tabs on your patients. We also saw an increase in the request for safety labs as patients would make perhaps an attempt to return to the site midway through a protocol and then have to completely pull away. So we knew that those things were going to be coming and we were prepared. We also saw an increase in the number of ad hoc visits that were requested. So an ad hoc visit in the home visit world would have been a rare thing prior to the pandemic era. And now we just ask, how many or what percentage of these visits do you think will be ad hoc? It's just a new paradigm for us that the set schedule of assessments, examinations, and labs, which had been so beautifully laid out in an SOE, that we would know ahead of time, for instance, in a home visit engagement, that we would be pulled in at week 8, week 12, week 16, kind of like a metronome, like clockwork. That was out the window and in some ways remains that way to date. So our experience really looked like the disruption of site labs were going to have far and deep effects in trials of every size. that the need to move IMP to patients, which had been problematic and resisted by IRBs and ECs globally for a decade or more, was going to have to be loosened. And we knew that the reliance on specialty couriers would have to evolve from a contingent only as a last resort kind of accommodation to one that might become more routine, and therefore the volume of requests that they were receiving, I'm sure, matched our own. So we also know that the supply chain mastery would become essential. The first wobbles in the supply chain that I think are worth talking about here, of course, revolve around PPE. Because we were prepared and because we had been providing home visits in rare and orphan diseases for so many years, PCM had a supply. We were able to maintain our supplies, and into the future, we have ensured our supply of PPE, not only to keep our patients safe, but our nurses as well. And you can imagine that the amount and the type of PPE that soon became routine, that list grew and grew. It went beyond a mask and perhaps a simple gown to goggles, fit testing our nurses with the proper masks, and our nurses are now all fit tested. And the importance of protecting the feet, the hair, everything that we came into the home with. We didn't want to bring anything extra in, i.e. a virus. And we certainly didn't want to have the nurse carry anything that she didn't, or he or she did not intend back out of the home either. So there was a massive uptake in the use and disposal and the management of PPE. And my final observation here is that the nurses were champions. We already knew, but boy, did we get a master class in the appreciation of the skill of a registered nurse around the world. Because so many of you are coming from a pharma background or a research background or work in those disrupted sites, I thought it would be worth taking a moment here to discuss, in the home visit paradigm, are there classifications or stratifications of users of home visits? And I think I get asked this question a lot. And if I had to define, look, when you encountered the pandemic, what were the kinds of studies that could be best served? Conversely, which were the types of studies that were harder to serve in the pandemic emergency? So really what we learned is that there are three types. The first type of study that we would serve or attempt to serve was a clinical trial that had no prior home visits built in, or any plans at all for alternate pathways around the sites as they closed down or were disrupted. It was very difficult, as you can imagine. Of the 881 requests for service that came in 2020, about 600 of them fell into this first category. And for many of them, the burden and the lift of taking a study, an ongoing study, or one that was about to launch, and bolting on a home visit component was very difficult. The patients weren't clued into the idea. The PIs weren't clued into the idea. Many sites were naive to the use of home visits in 2020. So the combination of access to nurses, the capacity to serve, and the comfort level of all of the stakeholders, from the sponsor to the CRO, the site, the PI, the patient, the family, there were many of those requests we had to turn away because there simply wasn't a way to efficiently bolt on a service that is best baked in. So the second type of study that we served, and this I think accounted for the bulk of sponsors using home visits at this time, is they would think about and build into their SOEs a contingent only kind of model for the use of home visits. These were trials that had minimal home visit components, but they were present. And if they were to be used, it was for only a tiny percentage or fraction of their patient population, perhaps patients that lived distant or were rural or in conditions that made their ability to travel dangerous in any event. These are the rare orphan, the very, very young, and the very, very elderly patients that made up the bulk of our patient served population prior to the pandemic. And for these folks, we were able, when they called, and there were hundreds of those, who said, okay, we had you only for 2 of our 13 visits. And now that our sites are so disrupted and air travel is completely upside down and our patients are terrified to leave home, what can we do to expand from these 2 or 3 visits to maybe 11 of the 13 that are possible? So we were very successful in this endeavor, and our customers that had these sort of contingent only plans were delighted when we would come back with an SOE review and say, you know what, I know you're experiencing all of this challenge. What do you say we give it a try, that we move, say, 8 of these 10 activities are possible with a registered nurse? Can you see a way forward doing that? Is it better than not any visit at all or suspending your trial? And for many of our customers, the answer was a happy yes. The third sort of trial, and we had a handful of these prior to the pandemic, but I would say that more than half of our trials now in 2022 employ this sort of third stage of usage, which is that they not only imagined and baked a home visit paradigm into the SOE in the protocol, were called out several times in the protocol, we were already in the ICF, that these studies found it very easy to continue as before. And in fact, a couple of them were delighted when they met their data locks, even in that late summer period of 2021. All of us held our breath, but that was something that we found to be immensely gratifying. And I'm curious, and I do encourage you to come to me with questions. If you can share your experience or ask general or specific questions about our experience, and I'm happy to answer those at the end. So those are the 3 types of trials that were being served during the height of the pandemic. But some of the other lessons that came to us were about the disruption at labs. Site labs in particular seemed to be really disrupted. And some of that was, if we look back 2 and some years from today into the past, is that there was an access issue. Many sites were in campuses or in hospital situations where they were restricting who could access the space at all. And the branded courier services stepped into this void very neatly and quite efficiently. I know that their businesses have grown as ours have, you know, and the trajectory is extreme, but we met the demand of our market, and it was really hard work, but we made it happen. I feel the same about our courier services, who worked with those site labs because we knew who was coming in, and there was a routine and a familiarity of process. So as the sites opened again, we often found that those site labs were still stressed and stretched for capacity. As COVID testing improved, so did the volume of COVID testing and the demand for it. So their time and its staff attention was just being soaked up by the ongoing sort of rhythm of this pandemic. It was also problematic in the movement of IMP to patients. This had always been a sticky point going back to the very first home visits that ever happened in 2003. We knew that direct to patient was possible, and certainly in the post-approval programs that had been going on for years. So many of the processes worked in parallel, but of course, when we add on all of the GCP that's required in a research situation, they were not as widely used because they were quite expensive. But it was the surge of COVID also caused a surge in interest in pushing that process of moving direct to patient front and center. So I thought I would bring for you an example of one IP logistics movement plan for a trial. it's been de-identified and we can consider it hypothetical. But you can see that the nurse and PCM and the sites and the pharmacy and all of the regulatory moves in a very complicated, and yet at the same time, you can see the symmetry is a beautiful thing. So in each step of this process, this IMP is moving through qualified hands, through the dispensing of the vials, kit assignment, the transportation and accountability forms. At every one of these many steps, there is a way, a method, and transparency as to where that IMP is moving and if it is moving within temperature. And from the receiving end, you know, it's a PCM nurse standing out on the porch accepting those vials handed over by a specialty courier with an accountability form. There are temperature monitors and even the shipping materials to return to pharmacy for accountability. So this is just one example. I wish I could show you, well, this is what is typical, and I really can't. At the current time, we have more than 100 studies in action. And as I looked at the IP logistics plan, really there are no two that are exactly alike. There are many that look similar. But when we take in an RFP and we go through that bidding process and then through a very complex startup process, this is one of the key pieces, in addition to nurse training and all of the documentation, is that logistics piece. So if you think about it, what we've really done and what many of you were participating in was building a bridge from the site where research had traditionally happened to the kitchen table. And in many ways, it is a metaphorical bridge because, yes, there was a lot of gaps in the perception and acceptance of people of this home visit idea, but it is also really a logistics bridge from point A to point B. And from that kitchen table back to the lab, we're building yet another example. But I did want to show you that along every step of the way, there is an accountability, a transparency, and a responsibility to get it right. And our champions in this and our partners were, of course, the specialty couriers, who, as we had to scale and evolve in real time, they did as well. And you can imagine that their difficulties were magnified because so much of the specialty courier business and industry relies on commercial flights, and they were drastically reduced or canceled altogether. So in a logistics chain, we saw many more insertions of if-then sort of loops. If the flights were canceled, then the plan would be we're driving to the next biggest airport, replenishing dry ice along the way. They were absolute champions, and I'm a big fan of the work that they do because they make our work possible. And of course, for all of us, that PPE and materials planning is key. I know that we are detecting, we are downstream and not directly impacted, but we know in our industry that there are little spot shortage of this, that, or the other thing. 1 week it might be infusion tubing, another one it's purple tops, whatever it may be. I think we're all learning that we really can't ever take that supply chain for granted again. And of course, our big lesson was that nurses were champions. We knew this to be true, but boy, the way that we work with our nurses at PCM, we employ these nurses and they stuck with us through some of the most exciting, nail-biting and tremendous professional activity that I've enjoyed in a very long career. And so at this time, I'd like to take a look at a couple of studies that we worked on. It was our nurses who stepped up to these really unbelievable challenges. The first of these was a COVID-19 monoclonal antibody study, and this is in the summer 2020 into the fall of 2020, so we're well ahead of a vaccine. So the clinical objective of the study was that it was going to be blinded to test an antibody treatment in trial participants who had been exposed to COVID-19. So who were these participants and what might we define as a location? These were residents and staff of long-term care facilities where a positive case had been reported. And so we knew we had a couple of dozen potential sites, but we didn't know when or where COVID would pop up, just as it was, I'm sure, in your own daily and professional lives. Well, things are good today, but that could change in an hour when someone reports a positive, right? So for PCM trials, what we did was build out with a very forward-thinking sponsor, a rapid deployment team of nurses. And while our CMRNs, or certified mobile research nurses, were used to performing home visits or visits in other places like schools, like campgrounds, wherever a home visit had been executed prior to the pandemic, we knew that the situations that we would be facing might look very, very different. So we were cross-training these registered nurses, not only to become really good at IP prep, because these were infusions, but to get them trained up, skilled up, and facile in infusion techniques, and to perform the follow-up visits. So as it happened, the sponsor asked us to engage in a long-term care facility that had a couple of positive cases, and it would be our job within hours. We would start to spin up that engine to get that positive case report, begin to load up in cooperation with our sponsor the supplies, and to make sure that our jump team of nurses that were in a COVID negative state, reminding you this was pre-vaccine, that they would need to arrive at that facility within 72 hours of that first positive case report, and to begin infusing everyone in that facility, from the receptionist, perhaps the dishwasher, the house cleaning staff, as well as elderly and in some cases very elderly patients. So then a follow-up team would follow that very busy sort of beehive of activity, conduct the follow-up procedures that are part of every bit of clinical research. And that research might have had to occur in individual patient rooms to mitigate, the spread of COVID or prevention of, as well as in the staff. In some of those facilities, it was the dining rooms, because residents were no longer receiving meals in a communal setting, but, tray by tray in their rooms, and to collect and report on that participant data. So that cross-functional team really required round-the-clock management from an operations center. And I can tell you, it was amazing that if a nurse fell to COVID, he or she would then be moved to the best hotel that we can find nearby so they could quarantine in comfort. But they then in turn became our recruiters. They recruited their fellow nurses, to carry on the work. It was truly magnificent to see. So overall, the stats from that trial were that more than 2,400 patients were seen, and across many treatment as well as follow-up visits, more than 100,000 visits, in fact, and that we had about 25 to 30 of these specialized nurses that really became jump team specialists, as well as more nurses, many more, who became the follow-up team. So this was a widely followed trial and gave everybody hope, of course, while we waited for the vaccines. So some of the things that I would just like to point out are we had to build it as we were doing it, and we had to do it within GCP. And I happily report that this did receive an EUA in record time, in part because of the rigor and the amount of detail that was given, not only in the visits, but in the reporting and the collating of that information. So let's fast forward a little bit into time. And of course, I know I, along with all of you, rejoiced with the development and availability of vaccines. And once the vaccine came rolling into view and we could anticipate its arrival, it wasn't long after that that another sponsor approached us, maybe based on our prior efforts, to work with them on an innovative design, which they weren't real sure about, but would be happening, and it would be happening relatively soon. And this would be an oral antiviral medication to treat COVID-19. So there were 3 different studies that were set up initially in this effort, and it would be global, of course, and there would be more than 8,000 participants worldwide, more than 175 sites across all of these dozen or so countries, and many of them would be initiating home visits maybe for the very first time. So if you remember, we talked about the ease or the difficulty of introducing a new concept in the best of times is a heavy lift for some, and in the midst of a pandemic crisis, even harder. But we were up for the challenge, and we actually concepted the operations plan in part based on our prior experience in the jump team efforts to this sponsor, where we could carry forward a plan with the skeleton of what would eventually be that study design. And we were able to get a first visit mounted and a nurse knocking on a front door in 14 days. To give you a little bit of context, a typical study for PCM takes about 8 weeks to set up in the best of times. And this one, we shrunk that down to the barest essentials and a lot of coffee to make that happen in 14 days. This was built with care and with tight attention to detail. There was no other way to do it, and there wasn't anyone else that the sponsor came to. We stepped into that challenge because the world could not wait. So moving very quickly and across shifting regulatory approaches, because again, this was global. And while we all hear about harmonization, I was waiting to see it in action. Unfortunately, it really didn't come out that way in the cooperation of nation by nation, their acceptance of these ideas. The sponsor had to work very hard to make this happen. But along with the whole PCM team, I think everyone in our company was involved in this effort in some way, shape, or form. They did reach an approved treatment result in under 5 months. So that was from our chair, from the mundane to the, I guess we would call it, super exotic pieces of what a home visit program looked like during the height of the pandemic. So as we plan for what's next, what, in my view and our view, makes a good study candidate for a visit program? As you're jumping into the second half of 2022, I'm going to ask you, if any of these are yeses for you, it may be time to maybe bake in a home visit plan for your upcoming trial. Are your endpoints derived from a heavy PK/PD schedule? If yes, maybe consider this home visit option as one way to ensure that patients don't fall away or become lost to follow-up. Is there an expectation of dose escalations in your protocol? If yes, we know that that cranks up the amount of lab work that's going to be needed to move those patients up, down, or around in that escalation cycle, and a home visit program can make that painless. And what is the profile of your intent to treat pool? Is it inclusive of minorities, ages, and geographies that you are not entirely confident you can serve? If that answer is yes, a home visit program can help. And is your trial competing against others for the same participants? This is becoming an increasing issue as the ease of an SOE to execute by a pressured site staff may make your trial an easier yes to arrive at if you have some accommodation for the patients that removes the burden of something like a 10-hour PK from your sites. And are your sites concerned about their planning for future waves of pandemic or other disruption? I don't think any of us can ever take that out of the back of our minds, the what if scenario. We skated by for many years without having one. I don't think we will again. So at this point, I would anticipate one of your questions, which is, as a home visit provider, what keeps me up at night? Well, a concern I have here in July of 2022 is that the regulatory agencies around the world have not yet settled on written positions around what will or will not be permitted in the home visits of tomorrow. A lot of strictures and attitudes were loosened in the pandemic because there was no other way forward, but we are detecting a sort of a shrinking inward again. And I cannot say that it's by region or by this or by that, but it seems to be country by country. So I challenge all of you in your work, let's work together to put patients first. And with that, I'll just finish up with a very few ideas about PCM and another thing that I've observed over time, which is that in the way back time, so going back to 2003 to the pandemic, most of the studies that were served were rare and orphan among the very young, the very old. And most of that work that was home visit served was in the phase 3 protocols. But I'm showing you, as of the last quarter, if I look at phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a couple of diagnostic or device protocols, we have shifted, and now more of our work is taking place earlier in that cycle. I find that very exciting. I'm also finding the uptake in the therapeutic areas that might be quite surprising to some of you, that we have 27 studies in the oncology space. And many of those originated in and after this pandemic's arrival. So I am thrilled to report that there is more and more work that can be done, especially if we make good plans in the protocol stage. And a thought with us, when is the best time to consult about whether your trial can or should be a candidate for home visits? It's never too early. We'd love to engage with you as early as a feasibility study to participate or attend quietly your advisory board or patient affinity meetings. Of course, many CROs and sponsors come to us during a bidding process, but that almost feels too late. You know, if we're in early when we're still in a synopsis prior to a baked and finalized protocol, we always love to engage. Unfortunately and sadly, we are often called when rescue is needed. A trial has been ongoing for some time and is either failing to enroll or patients are dropping away because the SOE is too demanding and they just can't stick with it. Rescue is no one's favorite flavor, but that is something we at PCM can step in because we work with employed nurses. We don't have a capacity problem. Our processes are filled with rigor and driven by GCP, that if a rescue is needed, we're probably a really good place to start. And of course, anytime anyone has a question, we do encourage and ask, let's talk about yours. So with that, Gina, I will open the floor to questions from our audience, and they can be as general or specific as you like, and I will happily entertain them.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, now is your chance to have your questions answered. Please remember this portion of the webinar is also being recorded. To ask a question, click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your window, type your question, and click Submit. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time. So here's the first question. What electronic CTMS system is used to communicate with the site or sponsor for home visits?
You know, that varies because here at PCM, while we are exploring a technology option of our own, we use whatever technology is put into our hands because we are waiting, as everyone is, for there to be some dominant system, one or two, sort of like we have Apple or Android with our phones. It took a while to get there. We work across, at this time, I believe we have 70 different sponsor or CRO clients of ours, and many of their systems don't play nicer together. So that is a more technical question that we use whatever technology is placed in our hands.
Thank you. Next question. What is the most extreme thing you've ever been asked to do?
In the pre-pandemic times, these were always my favorite question. In the pandemic and after times, I'll give you my most entertaining, I guess, or one of those that, you know, we put a postcard up on the bulletin board and we kept it there, and it's probably still there in our headquarters, is this was a registry study, and they needed a ton of blood samples from a related group of people, think a very large family, and there was an opportunity for the sponsor brought to us and said, hey, we have one of these ultra rares and they're having a family reunion. And we're like, oh, that's so nice. Because I'm thinking, oh, this will be like at a nice hotel sort of convention center. Oh no, it's a campground in the Denali.
Oh my.
So that became an adventure of multiple nurses in an RV with generators, Yeti coolers full of dry ice, and a whole bunch of centrifuges. So when we say home visit, about 90% of our visits happen at the kitchen table, which I think we can all imagine, right? But that other 10%, there were some eyebrow-raising locations, a construction site. For some autistic adolescents, the place to be became school because it was an injection, and these kids were already, the parents felt like they were challenging their children, and participation in a trial with injections on a regular basis was going to be a heavy lift for them, and they were kind of tired of being the heavy. So it was at the parent's suggestion, sponsor enthusiastically endorsed, and we supported, which was to see these kids at school where they expected to be challenged. They had teachers, they had their peers, they had health aides, they had classroom support. And in that environment was where these challenged kids were used to being asked to try new things. So why not this? So home visit maybe is a misnomer, but I think campsite in the Denali National Forest is probably our biggie.
Wow, in Denali.
I know, and talk about distance, you
Yes.
know, and that cold chain logistics, that was stretching, you know, Alaska looks so cute on the map as a state, but when you're driving it, it's an entirely different matter.
Okay, here's another one. Do you contract directly with sites or SMOs or primarily with sponsors?
Our primary contracting relationship is with the sponsor or the CRO. We are detecting that in rest of the world, especially in the EU, that sites are in the midst of some sort of evolution that they are asking for this. We have not formed a position. Again, as I pointed out in my penultimate slide, we're kind of waiting to see what regulators are going to do in the utterances that they have. One is due out of the EU by Christmas about what will and will not be accepted. And we are hoping that that EMA position that appeared in December of 2020 is more clearly defined. So we know, do we have to contract with the site, or can we remain in this very nice liability cascade with sponsor or CRO?
Thank you. Do you have any problems finding and keeping staff?
I can happily report that PCM, which is organized a little bit differently than many others in our space, at PCM, rather than subcontracting nurses to deliver the visits, which is a common model in the home visit industry, we have from day one employed these research nurses, our CMRNs. And part of that process maybe is why I can happily report We not only maintained our pool of employed nurses through the pandemic, we grew it quite significantly. And for, I think, maybe the most basic of reasons, because they are employed by PCM here in the United States and directly managed elsewhere in the world as much as possible, we are taking the time and trouble to invest in them and their expertise, their professional expertise, because how a visit unfolds at the site, which you can all imagine in your mind, I think we've all been to sites, there's a storeroom, there are other people. If my blood pressure cuff goes out on me, I can walk into the next room and pick up another one. You know, there's a lot of infrastructure and support for a research activity. If you think about your own kitchen table, we have to bring everything that is needed to provide a safe, controllable visit with us to the home, because we don't know what a kitchen table may look like until we walk through that front door. So by supporting and training our nurses and investing in their professional development, we have taught them the tips and tricks. These are the things that we have seen. Here are best practice. It may surprise people to learn that, you know, some of our challenges in the home are way different than those in the site. There may be disruptive pets, small children, you know, a needle stick is a pretty common thing in the healthcare world. We worry more about a dog bite because we've got that fur baby mom in a chair and we're sticking a needle in their arm. So our anxieties and worries look a little different than those of you who are at sites, but we know that we have provided the data, and it's resulted in, you know, there are now hundreds of drugs that have reached approval with home visits. So we work through the challenge, and our nurses have been great. So we are still able to attract and, importantly, retain the nurses that would be hands-on your patient.
Approximately how many home visits do your mobile research nurses do in a year?
Well, because we have nurses that are working, some of them full-time for us in certain geographies like San Francisco, New York, and a couple of other cities, we can keep a nurse busy 40 hours plus a week performing visits. But I did see a statistic because there was a little award that one of our CMRNs last year performed 156 of these research visits.
One CMRN?
One nurse performed 156 visits.
Oh my.
That's and you know, across the gamut. So I think also nurses appreciate being at the cutting edge of the future in healthcare. And where else better to do that than serving a rare and orphan trial or a trial in a disease condition that touches you personally? We all want to be part of the solution.
Next question is, how many countries does your company serve?
We're currently serving in nearly, I believe that number today is 48, but in the third quarter here, we're only partway through the third quarter, that number will move over 50. So we have experience in Latin America, of course, North America, Australia, New Zealand, EU, Eastern EU, and parts of the APAC. And I'm proud to say that many of these services are taken to patients in the underserved areas of each of these countries. It's really, really tough if you have a rare or orphan disease to get assistance at all. But if you live ex-US in a very rural situation, that bar gets so much higher. So I think nurses enjoy being able to bring participation possibility to so many.
Are there any myths or misunderstandings about decentralized trials that you hear from CROs or sponsors?
I do, and many of them are based in long ago experiences or from personal bias and anxieties. I spend a lot of my time professionally, sometimes at the request of sponsors, meeting with executives who are resistant to the home visit idea, to just unpack what that anxiety is based on. A lot of them are afraid this is, an unskilled pair of hands with sketchy needle experience in the home. There's just so much anxiety. And if I'm given the opportunity, and we love to do that, if you have anyone in your company who's resistant to this idea, just to walk them through the whole process, and then at the end show them, and this resulted in approval. There's nothing pioneering about this at this point, except that you're willing to try. So a lot of myths around sloppiness or the ignorance that a nurse can't spin down a sample in the home, that the logistics chain is going to lose their samples. So much is improved, so much is more transparent. But if they're basing their acceptance of this idea on a model that's 15 years or older, certainly things have improved.
I think we have time for one more question. With so many visits, and I'm sure different protocols, how did you manage to achieve on deviations? Can you share how you achieved this?
Can you read the question again?
Yes, with so many visits and different protocols, how did you manage to achieve, I presume, success on deviations? Can you share how you achieved this?
Sure. Deviations. As soon as I heard the word, I broke into a cold sweat and stopped paying attention. Thank you for repeating it.
Sure.
No, protocol deviations are still everyone's number one concern and a number one priority. And because the way that we are organized at PCM, we have expertise going back more than a decade, 14 years, almost 15 years. We have learned where things tend to go wrong, and we mitigate around them. So one, for instance, is the deviation of, well, we got there, we used standard lab kit, and let's say this was a type 2 diabetes study, and we needed to pull blood samples at very specific intervals, right? And if we went in with the standard lab kit, this is usually the number one deviation in home visit usage. You take in the standard lab kit, and it might have a number 3 or 4 needle as the standard. We've learned through many, more than 40,000 tries at this, that if it asks for a 3, I'm probably going to bring a 2 and a 4 and an extra 3, because needles break, they could be defective. We don't want to scrub a visit and then therefore deviate. If we can work around it with extra and ancillary supplies. Ditto for blood pressure cuffs. Ditto for any number of equipment failures that over time, for those equipment-based deviations, that's one way to correct. The larger deviation, of course, and perhaps what our questioner is concerned about, is what about those deviations in human error? And we believe here at PCM that if you train correctly and you train in ways that allow the nurse to learn and retain that information, deviations will fall. So the most important piece of our work before we knock on a front door is generating that nurse training. And that again comes with many years of experience that we know these are the tripwires in a IMP preparation. We're going to take what is the standard lab or pharmacy manual, and we're going to augment it with instructions and with training so that the nurse trains typically just like we are now in a Zoom, maybe even in person if that's possible, that the nurse has all of the pieces that will be present in the home, and the trainer in our headquarters, the project manager trainer, will be training that nurse to this protocol on this specific preparation example so that there are no surprises in the home. So we believe anything that we can train into reference, we will. When deviations do occur, something goes awry in the home, the nurse is on the phone to the site.
Thank you. Any closing remarks, Ellen?
No, other than thank you for this opportunity. Now that we're all in a place where we can maybe take a breath in our COVID experience before the next thing comes along. I hope all of your summer plans stay on track. Mine sure did. and it felt great to get out in the world again. Please come to us at PCM with your questions. We're worth a second look. Our employed nurse model has withstood the test of time, and when the world really, really needed a solution, the biggest sponsors in the world came to us, and we're very proud to have served.
Great. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of CenterWatch and PCM Trials, I would like to thank our participants for joining us today. Please be sure to fill out the survey. At the conclusion of this webinar, your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes today's event. I hope you join us again in the future.